This is Garis, Masculist MGTOW flyers, that is 2-3 page essays on the themes of Masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 557, entitled Pushing the Masculist Abolitionist Analogy. Description. There's a close historical analogy between today's masculism and the 19th century's abolitionism. Masculists see manslavery by fluffies as the greatest of all gender crimes and hate fluffies for that. Masculists' hatred of fluffies and fluffy feminists will force women to become biconscious, or they will pay a terrible price of being forced into a slow, miserable death by being forced to rot on the shelf, by being totally ignored by men, not even pumped and dumped. Now the flyer itself. Pushing the Masculist Abolitionist Analogy by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Masculists see women's manslavery as the greatest of all gender crimes in either direction, brackets, men onto women or women onto men, close brackets, because it is so vicious, exploitative and utterly callous. Masculists hate women who are manslavers, that is, fluffies and fluffy feminists, and punish them severely by effectively exterminating them, by totally ignoring them, not even pumping and dumping them, forcing them to rot on the shelf, manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, and rejected from society, forced to die a slow, miserable death. Why are fluffies so hated by masculists? What is so hateable about a woman who expects, fluffy style, to live off the labour and money of a man? Anyone who has to ask this question is obviously no masculist and is obviously stuck in the old gender role expectations. Over a century ago, a woman had little choice but to be a fluffy, since she had a dozen kids and was a full-time mother, while the father was out of the house earning the living to keep the whole family afloat, in an era in which there was no unemployment insurance, no labour parties, no welfare state, no pension, etc. Life was brutal in those days. If the father failed to bring home the bacon, the family starved. But things have changed drastically since then, since men gave women science-based medicine. So women now have a life expectancy of 85 years. Men gave women the contraceptive pill, household gadgets, higher education. So women now have a career window of half a century. So masculists place an enormous moral obligation on women to get off their fat, parasitic asses and FIP up, in brackets, FIP equals financially independent person, and not expect fluffy style to be able to live off the labour and money of a man, thus manslaving him for decades of his life. Masculists see close historical analogies between 21st century manslavery and 19th century abolitionism. The abolitionists thought Negro slavery was such an immoral abomination that they went to war over the issue with the US Civil War in the 1860s. Masculists see manslavery as a much bigger problem than was Negro slavery due to the numbers. Masculists see manslavery as 1,000 times bigger problem than Negro slavery, since there are 1,000 times more man-slaves in the world today than there were Negro slaves in the US in the 1800s. Slavery has been with humanity for thousands of years. For most of that time, it was considered normal. It was taken for granted that a conquered people were often sold into slavery to work for free for the conquerors. It was only recently, that is, only the last few centuries, that people began to see slavery as a moral abomination, and one that roused such passions that it was seen as a war issue. The UK did not get rid of slavery until 1807, and the US in 1865. If you were a typical southern state American in the 1850s, you probably would not have given Negro slavery a second thought. You would have grown up with it and considered it perfectly normal. When the Northern Yankees started expressing their hatred of Negro slavery to Southerners, war clouds started brewing. It was only 3 decades between the publication of the first American abolitionist newspaper, in brackets, The Liberator, by William Lloyd Garrison in 1831, close brackets, and the outbreak of the US Civil War in 1861. Masculists are very conscious that women now have a career window of half a century, so put tremendous moral pressure on women to become FIPs or to suffer greatly by being rejected totally, not even pumped and dumped. Why? Because of fluffy parasites of the very life of a man, manslaving him, forcing him to work for her for decades of his life, while she sits on her fat parasitic ass and wiggles her twat at him from time to time, to keep him being a manslave to her, to get a bit of sex from her from time to time. Masculists are very conscious of the close analogy between masculism and abolitionism, which is the main topic of this flyer. The more one thinks about the immorality of a woman, a fluffie, who expects to manslave a man, the more hateable she becomes in the mind of a man in the process of having his masculist consciousness raised. Fluffies are increasingly seen as vermin by more and more millions of men, as Masculist and MGTOW ideas spread across the planet. Masculists expect, over the coming decade, that in millions of cases, young fluffies will be brutally rejected by men, masculisted men, for not fipping up. These young fluffies will be increasingly hated, both in their private, social and sexual lives, and collectively, in public, in their high schools, as young fluffies find themselves spat at in public, rejected by their male classmates as fluffies, as immoral, parasitic, manslaving, bloody fluffies, to be hated and rejected for expecting, consciously or unconsciously, to be able to live off the money and labour of a man, that is, expecting him to work for her, which is the very definition, and for free, which is the very definition of slavery. And she's doing this to a man. So she is justifiably labelled by the Masculists in her social circle as a manslaver, a hated, manslaving, fluffy parasite, to be spat at, rejected, forced to die a slow, miserable death. To Masculists, fluffydom is manslavery, and manslavery is slavery, and hence hated by the Masculists and seen as a war issue. Since women are so much weaker than men, men have no fear of women defeating them in battle. So men can defeat women in a sex war by simply ignoring them totally, not even pumping and dumping them, thus forcing women to fip up. Feminists are increasingly being confronted with very angry, hateful Masculists who attack fluffy feminists for their hypocrisy and genocide. Feminists have had a monopoly over gender politics for 6 decades, so take it for granted that gender oppression is a one-way street, so feel justified in publicly trashing men for the ways that men oppress women. But now, men are intellectually armed with their own gender political ideology called Masculism, which sees women oppressing men far worse than vice versa. Masculists see women's decades-lasting gender crimes, brackets, such as women's manslavery, women's divorce rape, women's forced fatherhood, etc., as far more serious than the relatively minor ways that men oppress women. Masculists see even rape, one of the worst ways that men oppress women, as small beer compared to women's big three gender crimes against men listed just above. So Masculists are now on the attack, taking the gender political initiative out into the streets, to feminist talks, to private conversations, to group discussions, etc. So when some monoconscious feminist starts hearing some biconscious masculist starting to harangue the group how women oppress men worse, and launches into a feminist tirade, then increasingly such a woman is then attacked with such male aggressive verbal viciousness that she is shocked, thinking what has just happened to her is new, forcing her to think that something has happened to men that is giving them a new energy, a new religion, a new political, social force that frightens them, that they can't answer back to, since these very angry, hateful masculists are very frightening. These hateful masculists are saying horrible things about women, about fluffies, about fluffy feminists, and keep talking about a sex war, about how women are butchering men in the divorce courts and forcing men into fatherhood for decades of men's lives. In the next few years, millions of monoconscious feminists will go through this experience of being verbally crushed by very angry, hateful, biconscious masculists who have no patience nor tolerance of monoconscious feminist misandry, and will verbally attack such women, expressing their hatred of such women, and telling them if these monoconscious feminists don't quickly become biconscious, then they will be forced into a slow, miserable death, as most men become masculisted, have their masculist consciousness raised as they are taught masculist ideas, that is, how women oppress men, and far worse than vice versa. Any man, once he thinks through the horrors of what women do to men, particularly with the big three ways above that women oppress men, then inevitably he becomes angry and hateful towards these gender criminal women and learns to hate them. Over the years, this masculinist hatred of fluffy, manslaving, divorce-raping women will become collective, social, political, and finally legislative, as masculists push for the men-fairing of the gender laws. Women need to be made aware that when men collectively become angry at women, then God help women. Women will be unable to do anything about this masculist hatred, since, as the masculists point out, the ultimate backup of the law is brute male force. That is, male cops. But when the male cops themselves become masculisted, then women are fucked. They will be unable to do anything about the rise of masculinist anger and hatred. The only thing they can do is to become biconscious themselves, that is, learn how women oppress men worse, and then cancel their feminist anger at men by a corresponding masculinist anger at women, so that they lose their feminazi bitchiness towards men. If they don't, they rot on the shelf. They are harangued out of the room by very angry, hateful masculists who see monoconscious feminists as hypocrites and genociders. Masculists see fluffies as manslavers and future divorce rapists, so are hated. Masculists aim to wipe out such women, and we do that simply by totally ignoring them. We don't have to go out into the streets as masculist soldiers shooting feminazis on the spot. We can save bullets by totally ignoring fluffy manslavers and fluffy feminist hypocrite genociders who have made divorce so toxic for men that they have made marriage and paternity toxic for men. So in many countries now, 2/3 of young men reject marriage and paternity, thus crashing the birth rate and wiping out whole populations. But they are merely reacting to the toxicity of the divorce courts controlled by the hated fluffy feminists. So Masculists see these fluffy feminist divorce court lawyers and judges as indirect genociders, so they have to be stopped. One way to do this is with a shooting sex war. The other way is with a passive, total neglect of fluffies and fluffy feminists by punishing them to death, by totally ignoring them, forcing them to rot on the shelf. When there are millions of Masculists and MGTOWs, women will be forced to adapt, or they die out, spat at, hated, rejected, deprived of love, sex, babies, attention and respect. To Masculists, fluffies are manslavers and future divorce rapists, and hence are hated. To Masculists, fluffy feminists are not only manslavers, but hypocrites and genociders, so are even more hated. This decade is men's decade, the decade of men's liberation, freeing men from the massive gender crimes that women commit against men. Masculists are forcing women to get off their fat parasitic asses and fip up, or they rot on the shelf. Masculists yell at young women, quote, "Be fip or be manless. No calculus, no baby. Fluffies rot on the shelf." If you want a vivid image of how a freshly masculisted high school young man reacts towards his fluffy girlfriend, who has chosen to study fluffy crap majors, then have a look at flyer number